And I spent the first part of my career in academic research, and I had an NIH-funded research lab at Oregon Health Sciences University. And I left after about 6 years. I started getting frustrated with academic research for a variety of reasons. And I confess one of them was because I hated writing grants so much. And I was actually pretty successful at it, but it was just like pulling teeth. So it's one of life's little ironies that now I make my living doing it. And actually you can learn to sort of love it. So let's see, I advance this way. My sense when, so I'm relatively new to interacting with the business community, but the sense I get from people I talk to is that many people are reluctant to apply for grants from federal agencies because either they believe the government doesn't like to fund small businesses, or they think it's just too hard to write a grant. It's just, you know, there's something about it that's impossible. So I'd like to dispel both of those notions. First, the Small Business Innovation Research Program, SBIR program, is a federally mandated program since 1982. It has been required that federal agencies with extramural budgets above 100 million must administer these programs and give grants amounting to an annual set-aside of 2.6% of their institute budgets. So 2.6% of each NIH institute's budget is set aside for these grants, which means they're actually easier to get than standard research grants that academic professors typically apply for, and which have no set-aside. So you may have heard about the terrible pay lines at NIH, and indeed for regular research grants they are pretty bad, as low as 10th percentile. You have to be above the 10th percentile to get paid, but for SBIRs it's actually better than that. It's more like the 25th percentile. And with a second submission it gets up to more like 50% of the applications get paid. So what kind of money can you get through this mechanism? SBIR grants have, you apply for either a phase 1 or a phase 2. Phase 1 is feasibility and design, for example, developing a prototype for some software platform and then doing a little preliminary usability testing on it. And that's a relatively small award, $150K. But then if your phase 1 project goes well, you can apply for a phase 2, which is much more substantial. That's $1 million, and that's to further develop your product, refine it further, add bells and whistles, do clinical testing, or what have you. If you're wondering whether you're eligible for an SBIR, here are the guidelines. And now here's the hitch with SBIRs or any kind of federal grants, is that it's not fast money by any means. So if, for example, you were to submit an SBIR grant for the next deadline, August 5th, your grant would go to study section and be reviewed by your supposed peers in October or November, and then you wouldn't you'd hear a funding decision in a month or so after that, but then if the funding decision is positive, you wouldn't actually even get the money until April 2013. So that's 9 months between time of submission and time of payment, all going ideally, that is, you get paid on your first submission. There are 3 deadlines a year: April 5th, August 5th, December 5th. So if by chance you don't get paid on the first round, you can get right back in, get back on the horse and try again. And you can also submit multiple grants that are sort of clones of one another. Technology to treat, let's see, mHealth tool to treat smoking, mHealth tool to treat obesity. You can send those both in simultaneously. This one? Oh, these are the requirements to be eligible.
To submit a grant.
To submit a grant, yeah.
So is the only difference between SBIR and STTR? In the STTR, you have a university
Right,
conjunction
so
with
with the STTR is Small Business Technology Transfer Program, and that requires an academic partner at a certain percentage, I think it's 30% for the academic partner. And again, the idea with those is still to be moving work from the lab into the marketplace.
Can you speak to the last item, the IP security?
Yeah, that's my.
I was afraid you were going to ask me some hard business questions. I don't actually, I can't. That is something that you would have to delve into the small print for yourself. There is IP protection. I know for sure, else people wouldn't apply for these grants, but the details, if you want, I'll look them up and get back to you. Okay, so the other reason people don't apply for NIH grants is they think there's something like mysterious about it, that you can only get one if you know the right people, or the secret handshake, or the secret password, and that, you know, there's a lot of politics involved and only certain special people get funded. There is a certain amount of politics involved, but in fact, it's not really that mysterious. There are 3 basic rules for writing a fundable NIH grant. First of all, you have to have good science. That would be a logical plan of experiments, or in your case, a logical plan for product development that produces a useful return for the taxpayer dollar. I assume you all feel that you have that part in place. There has to be truth in advertising, i.e. you don't want to be overselling yourself or claiming that your product reduces some health problem by 25% if you don't actually have controlled trial data showing that. And then you have to present your work in a clear and interesting fashion, and that actually, number 2, is the hardest part for most people. Yeah?
What's the qualification of those reviewers? Like, who are those people who review?
It is extremely variable. So your grant gets sent to a studies section that ostensibly has expertise in your area, but particularly for SBIRs, it may be that there is nobody reviewing your grant who really knows that much about your topics. So when you write an NIH grant, you have to be selling to a assume you're selling to an audience that's intelligent but not necessarily expert in your area. And there are things you can do about directing your review. That's sort of part of the insider part of the thing. Yeah?
Yeah, normally, although we call it NIH grant, for SBIR, we have to find like sub-agency, like for example, NIMH for mental health.
Uh-huh.
You know, national health.
You have to pick the agency.
And then we have to pick a topic we are interested in, and then submit.
Not necessarily.
That's the way I kind of hard.
I'll be addressing that. Okay. So just briefly, there are a number of agencies that have small business grant programs. DoD actually has the largest SBIR budget of all the agencies. They have 5 times the NIH SBIR budget, and if by any chance your work is applicable to, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, you might think about applying to them. That would also include any stress-related health conditions such as depression, addiction, obesity, etc. They could have solicitations that would be good for you. NSF does a few health technology-related grants, not a lot. USDA also a few. Private foundations, urban legend has it that small businesses can get funded by private foundations. In my much trolling through foundation websites, checking this out, my impression is that most foundations do not give grants to for-profit institutions, or what do you call yourself, for-profit companies, directly at least, but they will give grants to academic researchers who might be working in partnership with you. And so it's worth, if you have a targeted disease area, to check out the nonprofits that are appropriate for that health area. NIH, so to address your question, NIH is composed of 27 institutes and centers, each of which is responsible for a certain group of diseases. You can find out the missions of each institute by looking on this website. The missions frequently overlap, so for example, Alzheimer's disease is covered by the National Institute on Aging, National Institute on Neurological Disorders and Stroke, National Institutes of Mental Health. So if you have a choice of institutes that are relevant to your project, your next thing to consider is what is the institute pay line. So the percent of grants that get paid in any round by each institute differs from institute to institute depending on how they've handled their budget. For example, the Aging Institute some years ago made a decision to sink a lot of money into Alzheimer's centers, big center grants to which then they were committed so that their budget for regular research grants then began to dwindle. So now their pay line is not good. So that's one criteria on which you would want to pick an institute if you have options. Another would be if you happen to know a program director at an institute who happens to be particularly interested in the topic you're studying. And you can find out all those things through various ways that I will reveal to you. Oops, that didn't work out well. So there are various websites where you can look up funding opportunities, searchable websites, and there's a list of them.
How do we get a list of that?
Pardon me?
We'll put that slide deck on the meetup site, so in a few days.
Yeah, if you guys,
Both slides.
if you want to email me for anything, you'll have my address at the end. So I'm going to focus on NIH because that's the major go-to federal institute for health technology and health in general. So you can either submit a grant through an unsolicited, as they call it, or investigator initiative route where you pick the topic, just completely, you decide yourself what your topic's going to be, or you can reply in response to a specific funding announcement. These are areas in which some person or group of people at NIH has decided we need to do more research on this topic. And the decision that they ought to stimulate research in a particular area can be motivated by, for example, a group of powerful, respected extramural scientists gets together and calls the institute director and says, we need more research money for the kind of research we're doing, and the institute director goes along with it. Or program directors may themselves see that there are certain areas that are being underserved and that need, a shot in the arm. And then sometimes fads will happen, and there's a fad right now in telemedicine. So one institute will get interested in, for example, virtual reality technology for obesity, and then that would be heart, lung, and blood. And then Mental Health Institute goes, oh, we should do something with virtual reality too. And so then their program directors develop an announcement. There are two types, program announcements, or PAs. These do not have funds set aside, but they are released to indicate that a particular institute or group of institutes has a special interest in the topic. And then there are requests for applications, or RFAs, in which there are specific dollar amounts set aside to pay, a certain amount of grants for each round. And it's typically not a huge number, so these can be dicey to apply for. If your project is like the poster child for this particular RFA vision, then you have a better than average chance of getting funded by applying through an RFA. But if it's not, then you probably have a worse than average chance. And in these case of RFAs, the institutes or the program director running the RFA typically has a pretty clear vision of what kind of application they really want, which may be based on some workshop that was held that decided what the needs were in a particular topic area. So the relevant NIH grant mechanisms for you are the SBIR, the STTR, which I now discussed. There's the funding amounts for those. And then, contrary to popular belief, businesses can apply for regular research grants, the standard vanilla R01 grant. Sadly, there is still prejudice on the part of study section members who are mostly academics against businesses applying for these grants. So you're better off applying for R01s if you have a partner who is at an academic institution and who would then subcontract to you. So then I mentioned the funding solicitation opportunities. If you want to submit a grant, if you go through the funding opportunities, nothing really applies to you, do not try to mold your research to fit some funding, something somebody at NIH wants if it doesn't really fit. Instead, just put in your project the way you envision it and submit through the NIH Omnibus SBIR, which is a solicitation that comes out every year that is for all comers. So the grants are expected to be investigator initiatives, that is, you come up with the ideas. And most of the NIH institutes participate in this, so then you also have the option of picking what institute or institutes to submit your grant to.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Do these tend to be of a certain size, these kind of investigator-initiated grants?
Everybody wants the maximum amount of money they can get, which is $150K for a phase 1 and $1 million for a phase 2.
But I'm guessing that's not like the average that's granted, but where is it?
I think it's close to
Really?
that,
Okay.
yeah. In fact, some people sometimes limit them. They describe more work than they can actually afford to do with that budget, and then they give that as a caveat at the end and say if the funds run out, the company will be willing to put in whatever is extra is necessary to make sure that the project comes to fruition. Okay, so where to look for NIH funding announcements is the NIH